The world's leading economic authorities this weekend sounded the alarm about the forces working against the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and other central banks as they combat the worst inflation in decades. The global economy was entering a new and tougher era. At least over the next 5 years, monetary policymaking is going to be much more challenging than it was in the 2 decades before the pandemic struck. We are in an environment where supply shocks are going to be more volatile than we've been used to, and that's going to generate more costly trade-offs for monetary policy. The US dollar strengthened to a 20-year high against a collection of foreign currencies this week, spelling more trouble for heavily indebted smaller nations around the world. The stronger dollar makes payments on loans owed in US currency more expensive. This comes as some lower-income countries face mounting economic problems, and others, including Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and Zambia, have already defaulted on their international debts. Last week, Argentina slapped sweeping new restrictions on imports of everything from whiskey to software to consulting services to try to contain inflation that's running at over 70%. The South American nation has been hemorrhaging foreign currency, and the strengthening US dollar threatens to make that worse. In July, the value of the Argentine peso fell to a record low against the dollar on the black market. Welcome to Savvy Economists. Today we would be reviewing the global economy and the impacts on debt crisis on various low-income countries and the world at large. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. The pace of price growth has rocketed as supply chain disruptions from COVID-19 lockdowns collided with high consumer demand fueled by unprecedented fiscal and monetary support since the start of the pandemic. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine delivered a series of commodity shocks that created yet more supply constraints and price increases. These dynamics have forced central banks to aggressively tighten monetary policy to ensure inflation does not become more deeply embedded in the global economy. But given their limited capacity to address supply-related issues, many fear they will be forced to deliver much more economic pain than in the past in order to restore price stability. David Malpass, president of the World Bank, warned that central banks' tools, especially in advanced economies, are ill-suited to address the supply-related inflationary pressures that are driving a significant portion of the recent inflation surge. The rate hikes are having to compete with lots of friction within the economy, so I think that's the biggest challenge that they face, he said. You're hiking rates in the hope of reducing inflation, but it is being counteracted by so much friction within the supply chain and production cycle. Key figures at both the Fed and the ECB made unconditional pledges to restore price stability. Jay Powell, Fed chair, on Friday warned that as a result, a sustained period of slow growth and a weakening of the labor market were likely. According to the business news service Bloomberg, the number of emerging market borrowers that have debt trading at distressed levels has doubled over the last 6 months. The pandemic played a hand in that, as many governments took on additional debt to subsidize idled workers and keep social services functioning. An investment analysis by Barclays Corporate and Investment Bank called the second quarter of 2022 an unmitigated disaster for the global economy and warned that the third quarter is shaping up to be the summer of discontent. Balcells says many of the larger middle-income countries can weather that storm, but others are getting battered. For instance, in May, Sri Lanka had a political and economic meltdown and was unable to pay its foreign debts. The default makes it nearly impossible for Sri Lanka to buy food and fuel on international markets. Other nations facing financial distress are spread around the world, including El Salvador, Pakistan, and Ghana. In Nigeria, the largest economy in Africa, inflation has hit a 20-year high driven almost entirely by skyrocketing food prices. Right now, the world is experiencing the worst food security crisis any of us have ever seen, says U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Speaking at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in late August, Thomas-Greenfield said much of the current global food crisis is driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She notes that before the war, Russia and Ukraine accounted for almost a quarter of global grain exports. The disruption to those grain supplies, she says, is doing more than just leaving people hungry. Food security is directly linked to economic growth, she said. And it matters because food insecurity leads us to political and social instability. And that endangers us all. The big question is how much instability the current global economic downturn will produce. Increases in food prices hit poorer nations and households harder than wealthier ones because spending on food consumes a larger portion of their budgets. For instance, the International Monetary Fund estimates that food makes up 40% of the consumer price index in sub-Saharan Africa while accounting for less than 20% of the index in advanced economies. We have the energy crisis, we have the food crisis, we have the supply chain crisis, and we have the war, all of which has profound implications for the economic performance of the world, for the nature in which the world is interconnected, and most importantly, for the relative prices of many, many things. Complicating matters are doubts about just how much policy tightening is needed in the face of unpredictable gyrations in supply and, in turn, prices. Currently, we have to make our decisions against the backdrop of high uncertainty. Interpreting the current data is challenging, and it is difficult to distinguish between temporary and sustained inflationary pressure. The next few years are at risk of being known as the Great Volatility, in contrast with the past 2 decades, which economists called the Great Moderation because of the relatively tranquil dynamics. Many officials have come to believe that the structural forces that kept price pressures in check, chiefly globalization and an abundant labor supply, have reversed. The global economy seems to be on the cusp of a historic change as many of the aggregate supply tailwinds that have kept a lid on inflation look set to turn into headwinds, warned Augustin Carstens, general manager at the Bank for International Settlements. If so, the recent pickup in inflationary pressures may prove to be more persistent. Skeptics of this view say they are confident that the world's leading central banks will be able to ward off entrenched high inflation. The issue central banks need to focus on isn't establishing inflation credibility. The issue is redoing the strategy and the inflation targets for a world where you're going to have more frequent and larger negative supply shocks. Long before the inflation surge, the Fed in 2020 announced it would target inflation at a 2% average over time in order to make up for past periods of undershooting the target. Last year, the ECB said it would tolerate inflation temporarily rising above 2% at times. When and how a central bank like the Fed and other central banks approach changes in their mandates will be critical, given their tenuous control on inflation and the risk that households and businesses' expectations of future price increases could become entrenched. China's economic growth slowdown has triggered a stark contrast in fortunes for its trading partners across Asia, with northern neighbors suffering while economies in the southeast are broadly holding up. The world's number 2 economy is still dealing with a slump in consumption and output brought on by lockdowns, compounding the hit to demand from a global semiconductor slowdown. China's retail activity flatlined in August, with e-commerce demand especially weak, according to satellite data, suggesting that consumer caution due to the ongoing COVID-0 policy and elevated unemployment remain major drags on the world's second-largest economy. Global inflation is finally coming off the boil, even if it's set to remain far too hot for the liking of the world's central bankers. That doesn't mean an early return to the subdued inflation that much of the world enjoyed before the twin shocks of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, or the end of monetary tightening anytime soon. Central bankers in Hungary raised the benchmark interest rate by a full percentage point to 11.75%, the highest key rate in the European Union. Gambia also lifted its rate by 100 basis points. Guatemala opted for a 50 basis point hike, while policymakers in the Dominican Republic went for 25. Turkey's economy lurched forward at a faster rate than expected, as the highest inflation in 24 years prompted consumers to bring forward purchases in anticipation of steeper prices ahead. About this time last year, Chileans were feeling flush and the local economy was hotter than perhaps any other on earth. What's shocking now to many in a country that's long prided itself on having the most stable economy in all of Latin America is the sudden nature of the turn towards stagflation. It's happening far more quickly and violently here than across the rest of the globe. The fate of the world keeps hanging on a balance, and little is known about what the final outcome would be. How are you dealing with the uncertainty the current global economy poses? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Remember to give us a like, subscribe, and turn your notifications on.